be the first speaker today. There's a little bit of pressure being the first speaker, but at the same time I stopped and thought about it and realised that by the end of the week you won't remember anything that I will have said, so I can just stand up here and chat away for a few minutes and hopefully teach you guys something along the way. So I'm here to present a paper that I wrote with these two gentlemen here. I'm the good-looking one on the left. If you do forget everything I say, come and talk to me later on and I'll happily relay some of the information. The gentleman in the middle there, that's my boss. I have to say nice things about him, otherwise Andrew will tell. He's been with JLL for about 15 years and he's worked on all sorts of great projects right around Asia Pacific. The gentleman on the right is Chris. He's our technical expert for Asia Pacific for our energy and sustainability services team. And you can tell that he's an expert because he's got white hair and he doesn't smile in his photographs. I fully believe that Chris has got one of the best backgrounds across all realms of engineering and sustainability, and there's very little that I can stump him on, so he's a great resource for us to have. You know, so what? You know, doesn't matter how good looking we are or how much white hair we have, you know, what do we know about property? Well, the good thing is we work for JLL, and you know, right around the world we operate in more than 70 countries, we manage more than 3 billion square feet of space, and we've got, you know, more than 50,000 employees right around the world. So we've got a great track record, a great pool of knowledge and people that we can pull that information, you know, and from our clients as well. You know, there's plenty of great information that they can share with us. When it comes to sustainability, we've got a big team. I think we've got the biggest team in sustainability from any property services company, certainly in Asia Pacific. So we try and relay that information back to you regularly. So the question that I'm going to be asking and then answering today is, how do we manage a sustainable tall building? You know, what does sustainability mean when we're talking about these mega tall structures? Is it any different from a regular building? And what are the things that we need to know about? So before we jump in on that, the point that it's probably worth mentioning is that the market's huge. There is so much going on. You only need to take a step outside and look at the sheer number of skyscrapers that are popping up right around Shanghai to realise that we're an urban species. You know, everyone is aware of the trends that have been happening over the last 50 or 100 years of the number of people that are moving to urban areas, and we know that that trend is continuing. So cities, that's where we live. And one of the things that is a byproduct of that, obviously, is that as we urbanise, we build up. You know, it's a great way to protect valuable agricultural land and other natural resources. Now, I won't go into it now, but there's also a great trend around urban farming, which is coming about from this verticalisation of big cities, which is quite exciting. So, land is at a premium, you know, but it's a very exciting place to be. You know, working in Asia, I find that it's just about every week I hear about a project that's 1 million square metres, 2 million square metres. You know, these huge mega projects that are out there, which is pretty exciting. But while it's great to be part of these projects that are the biggest this and the tallest that and the first that, we're using a huge amount of materials. And I often find myself stepping back and thinking, you know, where does all this material come from? You know, how many doors does it take to build this building? How much concrete? How much steel? You know, and what sort of impact are we having on the environment by using these materials at such a great rate? So when it comes to sustainability, do we forget about it? Do we just say, you know what, it's too hard? If we want to build these mega structures, if we want to be this urban species and build these buildings that are towering into the sky, do we forget about sustainability? Well, one thing to keep in mind that when we're talking about these buildings is that the life cycle changes. So in a traditional building or an older style building, it might be the case that gets built and it stays in place for 20 or 30 years before being knocked down or turned into something else. But when we're talking about these mega tall projects, this is something that might have a life cycle of 60 or 70 years or maybe even longer. So on one hand, we're using a huge amount of materials, but on the other hand, we're creating an asset which could be in place for a lifetime or more. So where's the balance point for that? I guess the point that I try to remember is that the decisions that we make early on have an impact for a very, very long period of time. So looking at the total cost of these operations is really important. But unfortunately, I don't think people are naturally very good at looking at total life cycle costs. You know, if you look at something, you say, this item costs $10 and this one costs $11. So I should pick the cheaper one, right? You know, it's simple. Well, does the upfront cost really matter if you're going to be using that product for the next 60 or 70 years? You know, not really. But naturally, that's not something that we do. And I think as an industry, we need to push ourselves to be thinking much longer in terms of the life cycle there. So the good news is that I think there is an answer, and it's a pretty simple answer. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about these three elements that I think are the key winning formula to how you deliver and manage a sustainable tall building. So design, team, and technology. First off, the thing to keep in mind about these huge projects is that they're not that different. You know, although they're huge, although they're much bigger than we've done in the past, it's the same equipment that makes them up. It's just more of it. So instead of it being 3 chillers, maybe it's 5 chillers, or 10, or 20. You know, JLL was involved in a project a little while ago that had almost 50 chillers, and that sounds really scary, but then you step back and you realise it's just a chiller. You know, we know how to run that. We know how to design that efficiently. We know how to commission that efficiently. You know, we know how to reduce costs. So what's the big deal? So we're not really learning new skills as an industry. It's stuff that the property industry has been doing for quite a long time. What we are doing is we're learning to think bigger. So straight away you start to see the interplay with technology. So in the past, in a simpler building, you might have gotten away with having manual controls, you know, looking after the plant and equipment there, and having an alarm go off on a BMS and someone runs down to the plant room to open a valve. You know, that kind of thing is not going to cut it when we're talking about mega projects that are hundreds of metres tall. You know, you need to have a greater degree of technology overlaying that infrastructure so that you do get the most out of it. The other things to mention are around tracking performance, investing wisely and reducing costs. These are no different than what we've been doing in other properties for a very long time. So we don't need to throw everything we've learned out the window just because we're building at new heights. Having said that, these new buildings are totally different. And the first way that they're different is in the way that they're used. Pardon me. So if you think back, 20, 30, 40 years, the way that we design buildings was often quite simple and quite predictable. They were offices. These tall skyscrapers, that was the way that they were used. And it could be the case that it was a single tenant occupying the whole space, and they used that space in a very predictable way. They came to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, they left at 6 p.m. at night. Maybe it was one property team that was managing that for a very long period of time. So they knew via predictability how to operate that site effectively. So they can implement their schedules, they can make their improvements and tweak that building to be really efficient. So now when we're talking about these mega projects, the first thing that we see is that they're very different. Yes, they're offices, but they're also hotels and apartments and shopping complexes and, you name it. In fact, this building is a great example of that. 50 years ago, if you said to someone, you could wake up in your apartment on the 50th floor and go down to your office on the 10th floor and then have lunch on the ground floor and then back to your office and then go and have a drink at the hotel on the 80th floor, that sounds nuts, but that's the reality that we're living in now. So when we're talking about these mega projects, we need to think quite differently. So going back to my earlier example of a simple building, which was more predictable and therefore easier to be more efficient, in these new buildings, we're losing some of that predictability. And what instead we need to replace that with is flexibility. So a modern building that's efficient is one that can scale up and scale down to meet these variable usage patterns in a very different way. So property management teams are looking at a site saying, well, now it's not being used in that 8 till 6 or very simple format. I need to look at this site and say, well, that part of the building is running 24/7 and that part runs 8 till 6. This part needs heating, this part needs cooling. This part is fully occupied, this part is not occupied. So it's that flexibility that we need to be building into the building infrastructure from a design perspective to be efficient in scaling up and scaling down. So the buildings are becoming more complex, and the other element to think about is that obviously this means that more people are going to be in these sites. I mentioned before about that simple analogy of an older style building. Perhaps there's a couple hundred people in there. Now we're talking about thousands. To use an analogy from JLL, it's like saying we've gone from managing the local football tournament to managing the Soccer World Cup. So the scale of what we're doing is vastly different. And in addition to our property teams having the right technical skills and knowing how to manage those chillers and those pumps and those cooling towers, how to manage all of that effectively, they also need to have a whole new set of skill sets around communication skills, around tenant engagement, around people management at this vast scale, because it's not something that they've done in the past. So their job is as much about engineering and technical aspects as it is about human interface. And when you think about these sites as being huge, mega tall buildings. You can imagine that you don't learn these sites overnight. You know, it takes time to learn everything there is to know about one of these big buildings. So things like career development and professional growth are really important. You don't want to be hiring someone, training them up, getting them up to speed on a building and then having them walk down the road to get a new job. That's going to be bad for us, it's going to be bad for the building operations team, it's going to be bad for the building. So we need to be focusing on how do we give career pathways for our staff to stay in their jobs longer, to grow in their own careers and keep that knowledge within the firm. So while I said that people matter, timing matters too. So in the past, a typical handover process was pretty straightforward. It was you would complete construction, you would hire a property management team and you'd hand them the keys and say, there you go and run that building. You know, that might have worked in a simpler building, but it wasn't an ideal process. It was something that was really setting the property teams up to fail. So what we've been advocating is for an earlier engagement of the property management team, particularly on bigger sites, so that there's more time for them to learn how that site is supposed to operate. So if you're a designer or an architect and you have this beautiful vision of what this building is going to be, don't do a crappy job of handing it over. You know, make sure that you're giving the site operations team a fair chance to come in there and learn that vision, because it does take time. We are talking about a very different scale here. And that handover process is also a two-way street. So it's not just that the designers and the architects are providing information to the operations team on here's how you should manage the site. It goes the other way too. So designers and architects are great, they do a great job, but let's face it, they don't run that site every day for the next however many years. It's the operations team. So they'll be able to provide critical inputs into that design process and say, these are the things I think you should think about. These are the things that you could perhaps do a little bit differently and which are going to make it, you know, a better building for them to operate. I also want to touch on commissioning. So commissioning is something which, unfortunately, as an industry, we don't do very well. You know, there's always tight construction timelines. It's something that tends to get forgotten. And buildings get handed over in a way that they're not really set up to really hit their top performance right from day one. So there's a whole raft of issues there. And what that can result in is a whole lot of finger pointing. You know, the property management team is blaming the designer and the architect and the contractor that did this. The truth is no one really knows whose fault it was. You know, there's so much grey in that scenario there because the building wasn't commissioned correctly. So therefore, is it the property management team that's run that building badly, or is it something else? You know, so here's a tip. If you guys want to have a punching bag and you want it to be the property management team, make sure that you commission the building correctly, because then if it does start to perform badly, you know that it is the property guys. It's not the contractors or the construction people. So I'd encourage you to think about that missed opportunity, or how you can capture that you know, those additional benefits there. So the right property team exists to make sure that this, you know, the beautiful design that the architect and the designers dream up doesn't turn into this. You know, that's the property management team's job. You know, I put this photo up here and it's a little bit misleading because most of the time when problems occur on a property site, it's not quite so dramatic. It's more subtle. It's these niggling little issues with commissioning that weren't fixed from day one. So it's not so much that your Ferrari crashes into a tree, it's that it gradually runs off the road. It's gradually using more fuel. It's running through tyres and parts and things like that much more than you would expect it to be. So it's hard to see whether that's really something that is that what we should expect from a building, you know. But I look at this from a perspective of sustainability. So pushing things like LEED and green buildings and green building rating tools in the market. I see it as being really important that these buildings operate correctly, because if they don't, it actually undercuts the whole point. You know, sustainability has been around for a long time now, but I don't think it's set in stone in all of our minds. You know, and we only need to have a few examples of these green buildings that we've spent a huge amount of time and effort designing and building to go badly before we start to question whether this is something we should be doing at all. So it is important that these buildings that we design translate to an operation which matches that. So I want to talk about technology, and I see technology as both a blessing and a curse. So what I mean by that is that technology is great, but it's also really challenging. So when we, as building designers and building architects, there's been a big trend in green buildings to go and throw a whole bunch of technology at a green building. Solar panels, black water recycling, all of these things. On paper they sound good, but in reality, sometimes they can be quite difficult to live with. They can be quite expensive and costly. In a really bad scenario, they're actually going to be taking time of the building operations team away from what they should be focusing on. I look at it from a 80-20 perspective. So this is sort of the secondary design elements, the solar panels, the black water. If you're spending more than 20% of your time on that secondary design elements, then you're probably not focusing enough on the fundamental design elements, the HVAC performance, all those other aspects of how the building is meant to be configured. So these are great technologies, but they can be used in a kind of a way that distracts the teams. I'll give you an example of one that I saw. I'm originally from Australia, and a few years ago there was a number of people came across the great idea that they were going to start investing in trigeneration. So in case you're not aware, trigeneration is a big natural gas generator that sits in the building basement, and it generates power for the building as well as heating and cooling. So the rationale was that electricity in Australia was provided mostly by coal. So by switching to natural gas, we were cutting down emissions, and we're also having this secondary benefit of heating and cooling coming from the site. So it sounds great. It sounds like a really good idea. But what we found was that trigeneration systems were actually quite difficult to live with. They were oversizing these generators to provide capacity for the building, but then we realised that they don't like to run at low load. They like to run 24 hours a day in like a hospital or that kind of scenario. And if your office is a 8 to 6 operation, it's not really matching the right technology with the right operations needs. We also found that the heating needs of an office building or a typical office building often weren't that high. So, you had this extra heat problem. There was also scenarios where companies were saying, well, maybe I've got extra power and I'll feed that into the electricity grid. And then the local electricity provider said, no, we don't want you doing that. We can't control the way that you're generating power, and therefore we won't let you. So what ended up happening is that this kind of great idea, which on paper sounded fantastic, but in an operational sense, it wasn't really all that well suited. So a lot of these technologies got turned off. You walk into the plant rooms of these buildings now and they're silent. So companies have spent millions of dollars and lots of time and effort investing in this big piece of equipment, only to find that a few years later it's quite hard to live with. So do we blame trigeneration? No. It's not trigeneration's fault. It was being used in the wrong application. It's a great technology, but it wasn't being suited for the sites that it was getting rolled out into. So two of the technologies that we use, I don't think technology is all bad. I think that there's plenty of places for it to work. And the way that I look at it is that it should be an enabler. It should be making your life easier, not harder. It should be making your building more effective, more efficient, lower costs, not the opposite. So two of the technologies that we use are called ESP and IntelliCommand. And I'm not going to go into them now, but other than to say that they connect up to a building automation system or building submetering. And the job there is to really dig in on how the site is operating and try and find ways for the site to operate better. Try and give information in a timely manner to the site operations team to say, this is how you make an improvement on your building. So some of you might say, well, isn't that the job of the BMS? Isn't that the job of the operations team anyway? And you're like, yes, it is, it's true. But if you think about what I said before, we're building these buildings which are so much more complex now, and our site operations team are busier than ever. They're not just technical guys now. They're communications people, they're crowd control, they're doing all these things. They're stretched paper thin. So we need to help them as many ways as we can to give them the right kind of information at the right time to make the right decisions. So that's where I see technology as a great enabler. So I would ask you, any of you that are working in this space, to step back and assess, does the technology that I'm putting into my building, does it make my life easier or harder? And if you're finding that it's high cost, it's high maintenance, it's all of these things, it's probably not the right choice. I'm going to brag for just 1 minute here. This is a project that we wrapped up just last week. So this is a fairly large building in Beijing. It's one that, it's one of the largest LEED existing building certifications in mainland China. So it was something that my team worked on with the local property management team, as well as with the client and many of the tenants there. And the The thing that strikes me about this project is that there was no silver bullet. There was no magic formula. There was no way that we made this building so much better than all of the rest by spending all this money on a particular piece of technology or a particular design element. It was lots of simple things done well. You know, the design was relatively straightforward. The investment in technology was modest. You know, the site team was engaged. The client was engaged. The tenants were engaged. So pulling all of those things together, it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated to achieve something really great. So that to me is where the winning formula really ties together. So this is my last slide, guys. What I wanted to close on here is that I see this trend of urbanisation, of verticalisation as being something that's really exciting. I think it's something that there's a huge opportunity for us to be much more sustainable or to make lots of mistakes. So hopefully some of the things that I've been talking about today will resonate with you, and it will come home on how you can achieve more from a sustainability perspective through a fairly simple approach. It doesn't have to be high cost. It can be pretty straightforward. The other thing that I think about is that this trend is happening right here in Asia. That's pretty exciting. So over the next 20, 50 years, we're going to see this great influx of sustainable tall buildings happening in Asia. And to me, I think that you know, potentially is going to become a great export commodity for Asia. We all know that China loves its green technology and they see themselves as being an exporter of green technology in the future. Why not green property management know-how? Isn't that something that's going to be great? You know, yes, we're still going to look to the US and Australia and elsewhere, and they're going to keep pushing the boundaries, but this trend is happening right here in our backyard, so why not capitalise on that?